course, we all know that the first document issued by the Pope Francis, is the joy of the gospel. I consider it as one of the most important documents of the magisterium, of the teaching authority of the church in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, when we look at Pope Francis, he is the first Jesuit, the first South American to be elected to the papacy. And this encounter, that's ideal encounter between the Western, the so-called the North Christian Northern hemisphere and the Southern hemisphere, this encounter between, I remember he was also a migrant, his parents, grandparents came from Italy. So he himself lived existentially, personally, the situation of encounter among different cultures and ideas and ways of life. But there's a second idea that in Pope Francis is that for him, encounter is not merely a question of ideas, although he acknowledged the importance of ideas, but he said explicitly that ideas are useless or harmful if they are not translated into actions. So ideas are simply help us understand reality so that our actions correspond to the needs of the time and the locations. And so that's the second idea that I find so impressive in Pope Francis' idea of ideas lead to action. Ideas alone are abstract, are basically useless unless they lead to action. And in his latest encyclical, the Fratelli Tutti on the human fraternity, that point is made extremely clear that ideas must lead to action. And this, what action is, to foster, to promote this, he called it human fraternity. We could call it global friendship and encounter. So again in his many writings and speeches, he makes this the culture of encounter. Notice the two words, culture. It doesn't mean simply an act, or simply activities. No, we do that. We encounter other people, we do this and that and do all kinds of activity. But he focused on the culture. It's a way of thinking and a way of doing of a whole nations, of whole people. So the culture of encounter, this is so special, so unique, so original with Pope Francis. The third idea that I find also very distinctive is that in this encounter, he again emphasized the mutual respect. You cannot have global fraternity or human fraternity or friendship without the mutual respect. What does it mean, mutual respect? For him, mutual respect is to recognize that the other is another. Therefore, that other can teach me something that I don't know, that can transform me. So recognize the other as other. Philosophy talks about the alterity. So the other is not simply a mirror image of myself. It's simply another myself that I can see it. No, it's something other, and therefore, if I respect the otherness of the other, in the encounter, I can learn something. I must be willing and open to learn ideas, ways of life, stories that come from, and lastly, he said, even religion. So this is the third idea. That is the not only fraternity, but also not only important of praxis or doing against ideas, not only the idea of respectful listening and learning from the other, but for him, the other is not limited to simply the area of economics or politics. He specifically mentioned the idea of religions. In his apostolic exhortation, Querida Amazonia, about the meeting of the Amazonian bishops, he said clearly in that text that we have to learn from the religious traditions of the indigenous people. So that is the third. And fourthly, I would like to say that one of the images that stick in my mind that he uses the image of the polyhedron. Polyhedron meaning, in Greek, poly meaning many, hedron means surfaces. So that the reality for him is like a polyhedron. That is, there's so many surfaces, there are many realities that we cannot, none of us is able to grasp the reality as many, multiple, diverse. We can see only one aspect. There is an Indian story of 5 blind men looking and touching at the elephant. Each one of them says something about the elephant, the tail or the head and so forth. So polyhedron, reality is polyhedron, as Pope Francis says, it is that we cannot, none of us can really claim that we have a fullness of understanding reality. I have one text that I like to cite to end my answer to the first question you raised. I quote, "To dialogue means to believe that the other, as I said, the other has something worthwhile to say, and to entertain his or her point of view and perspective. Engaging in dialogue does not mean renouncing our own ideas and traditions, but the claim, renouncing the claim that they alone are valid and absolute." This is one of the most explicit acknowledgement of the, we call it religious pluralism. No Pope before him has made that kind of statement so clearly, so explicitly. And I think that is something that is extremely difficult for, particularly for Catholics and for Catholic Church to recognize this. For other religions, maybe, for Hinduism, maybe, or even for Buddhism, but for the Catholic Church to recognize that we must reject the claim that our ideas and our traditions alone are valid or absolute. First of all, I have to say that it is a long process. I never started out with the idea of encounter. All of us started from somewhere, from some very specific, well-limited, delimited location. So I am an Asian, I am Vietnamese, that's what I know. But when you're talking about experience, when I went to Rome to study theology in 1968 to 1972, 4 years, right after the Vatican II ended in 1965, I started theology in 1968. At the university, there was a beginning of realizing that something is changing. Up to that point, people think that there is a monolithic image of what the Catholic Church is and what theology is. But after Vatican II, we didn't fully grasp. We started understanding that there are diversity of cultures, diversity of ideologies, and diversity of theologies and religions. And we do not consider the other as erroneous, as superstitious, as something that we can come out and correct them and eliminate them and then replace them with our own ideas. So that's a gradual. But even so, up to 1972, we have no courses in my 4 years on religious pluralism. The ideas that even didn't emerge in the curriculum. And it's only when I come back to Vietnam, I began serving in the schools, in our prisons. I realized that the theology that I learned are good, but they cannot be transported or transferred or translated word for word or concept by concept to the local people. So in this encounter between East, as we say, East Asia, and the West that I learned from my theology. And then the second experience I have is coming to the United States in 1975. I came as a refugee. And then I was confronted with a totally different way of understanding, of living. The way American thing is not my way, the way, and so that there is this experiential encounter with others. Before, I never knew what America was at the time. I heard about it, never heard anything. But when you start living in the place, you start being immersed in the culture and talking English, you learn something new. And the third experience I have is the idea of encounter other religion. As I was professor of theology at the University of Dallas and at Catholic University, I had the opportunity to learn about, and not only learn about, but meeting people of different faiths. Before that, different faith is an ism, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever you call it, a kind of theory. But when you come to know persons, individuals as other, not as a projection of my understanding of reality, but as other who are so different from me, then I can learn. So I had a long, almost 30, 40 years now of encountering people of different faiths, friends that are not Christians. I have very dear friends who are Buddhists and Hindus and Sikh and all kinds. When I was in India for a conference, there was a local Sikh, and he saw me, we talked, and he took out his turban, Sikh turban, and he put it in my head and say, you are now an honorary Sikh. And he gave me his bracelet, because Sikh always wear bracelet. He didn't give me a sword, of course, but at least then you realize that it's only in friendship, or to use a language, the word expression of Pope Francis, in human fraternity, that we can have. So these are the experiences that I have. If I have time, I can tell many other personal stories, but at least those are the three phases of mine: educate in the West, living in the United States, and third, having this personal encounter with people of different faith. Let me tell you a story that happened the year 2000. The year 2000, about 24, 25 members of my family went back to Vietnam. Among them is my mother. And so we wanted to see the place, to visit the place where I used to teach. And nearby there was a Buddhist pagoda. And so we came to the school, and the school simply was already had been confiscated by the communists after 1975, so we see nothing else. And then outside we saw this huge pagoda. I knew that it was next to our school, so we went over there. And there was a young lady, maybe 20 something, early 20s, and she gave us a tour of the pagoda. And what we saw was when we entered into the pagoda itself, we saw in front of us a huge statue of the Buddha on a platform, and there were a lot of offerings in front of, fruits and incense and so forth. And at that moment, my mother and I and many of us would stood in front of the Buddha, statue of the Buddha, and my mother began praying. I do not what she was praying, but she was praying. She collected herself and she put her hands up like this and prayed. And then when we came out of the pagoda, she took some money from her purse and put in the collection box. And I said to myself, I would say, Mom, you gave money to the church, you don't give money to a pagoda. And she said to me, son, the Buddha was a holy man. Now, remember that my mother was raised in a Catholic culture that regarded Buddhism as a terrible superstition. The Catholic Church at her time, not our time, at her time said only Catholic can go to heaven, can be saved. Therefore, people of her age were not permitted just even to go enter, let alone enter the pagoda, and not to mention praying, not to mention giving money to the pagoda. Now, that sort of encounter in prayer can really change the way you think about other religions and other people. You don't see them through our own prejudices and receive teaching, but you encounter another person, the young woman. We asked her who she was. She said, I came to the pagoda age of 5 or 6, and then I grew up all the way for 20 years. I lived in this pagoda. And that is a living, a convincing example of how faith transforms people. And that woman was able to live her life dedicated to the temple. So those are the thing you asked me, what experiences is that experience. And the second experience happened to me way when I was already in the United States. I was invited to give a lecture at Payap University. Payap University is a Presbyterian university in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Chiang Mai is northwest of Thailand. So I went there, gave a lecture, a keynote address to the people. And afterwards, we have a day free. So I went out and looked at the city, and I walked by myself, and I saw a huge complex of pagoda, not one, but several, a huge one. So I entered there, and I just looking at all the little pagoda here and there and so forth. And finally, I entered into the main building, and there's, again, it's a biggest statue of the Buddha sitting on the stage, and besides, both sides, there were other Buddhas and so forth. So I saw a woman, maybe in her late 30s or something, and she was sitting in front of the statue of the Buddha. We call it the Goddess of Mercy, and she was praying. And I just didn't want to go up and disturb her. I was staying in the back, and for almost 40 minutes, I could see this woman sitting there, totally, absolutely, completely absorbed in prayer to the Buddha. I do not know what she prayed for or how she prayed, but she stood there for sit there, cross-legged for 45 minutes. And I was thinking to myself, how many of us would do that? Catholics. How do many of us can enter into that deep and profound communion with whatever we call God, Christ, the Buddha, and so forth. And so for me, that was an example of what I call the praying church, Ecclesia Orans, the praying church, the church that pray. And so encountering these things, I can have also my visit to the mosque in Istanbul several years later, also have this sense of how people, so that is an encounter that shape and change the way you see reality. I think this project that Dr. Banchoff has started, and all of us participate in this, what I suggested to Dr. Banchoff was to not only limit it to people of one religion, Christians, but also looking at some other religions eventually. But at least for now, I suggested that we do not simply gather Catholics, because of course we talk about Pope Francis and so forth. It is natural that we think of Catholics, but think of non-Catholics, Christians, Protestants, and so forth, evangelicals, just to see even among Christians themselves, there is not one single way of encountering reality, encountering the truth. So that's my thing of the kind of multifaceted. As I mentioned before, the favorite image of Pope Francis, the polyhedron, the many faceted, many faces, many surfaces reality, and listening to encounter from, let's say, from a Pentecostal or from a Baptist or from Presbyterian or whatever denomination they become, can really enrich us to understand what it is encounter. The second suggestion or experience I would like to see is that this encounter is not limited to simply discussions of ideas. It has to translate, as Pope Francis said, ideas are good, but they're useless if they're not followed by action. So the idea is that somehow we can later in our process, and once we started the process, we can create these transnational, even transcontinental communities. They keep that going. This encounter that we learn, let's say here in Rome and so forth, let's say one person go back to Africa, one person to back to Asia, can really bring the ideas or whatever they have learned into the local culture. So that those things, obviously intercultural and interreligious aspects are central for me, but I can see it how very often people in academia just simply walking through ideas, and that's not bad because that's what it is our profession, that is our bread and butter, if you want to use that word. But there are some people who are really engaged in transforming the world, and today you look at the terrible thing that happened in Kentucky and so forth, the tornadoes and so forth. We cannot just simply think about ideas without looking at what create these terrible tornadoes that can run through 5, 6 different states. And then we can realize that we cannot discuss just one aspect, politics, without looking at economics, without looking at globalization, and looking above all at the ecological damage that our politics and our economics create. So that's what I like to see, the cultural encounter or dialogue encounter. I prefer the word encounter because it's more real than dialogue. Dialogue simply sometimes just simply words, but encounter is person to person contact. So I hope that could be one way of moving or going forward.